Welcome to Here You Go. Here You Go is a project I started in order to present media that has been created or enhanced with AI. The project is primarily for my own entertainment and experimentation, but feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy it too. And now for the presentation. Third Planet by Murray Leinster is a science fiction story that explores themes of war, survival, and the potential consequences of human conflict. Set against a backdrop of political tension between warring factions on Earth. The narrative follows the crew of the survey ship, Lotus, as they discover a desolate planet that once thrived with life. Part 2. A great many of its citizens were shot, some for opposing the new state of affairs, but some seemingly just on general principles. Chapter 3. The Lotus went on toward Planet 5, leaving a world which should have been alive and wasn't, to go to a world which should not exist, but did. On the way there was argument which became embittered. In theory, the discoveries made by a survey ship became automatically available to all the world. But the discovery of 3 in the state it was in would have political results on Earth. It was and is a fact that nobody really believes in death until he sees a dead man. And nobody can believe in the destruction of a planet unless he's seen the corpse or color photographs of it. But that was precisely what the Lotus had to carry back to Earth. The WDA nations would see those pictures and read the facts. They would believe in atomic war and the complete sterilization of a world. The calm nations would not see the pictures. They would continue to believe that the WDA was decadent and enslaved to tyrannical warmongers, and obviously could not resist the splendid armed forces of the Calm Association. And they wouldn't really believe there could be more than isolated, crazy resistance to their valiant troops. So they'd back their leaders with enthusiasm, and the Western peoples at most would be merely desperate. The Lotus arrived at Planet 4, which by the Loreac laws should have been similar to Mars. It was almost its twin. It had ice caps of hoarfrost and its atmosphere was thin and barely contaminated by oxygen. A base could be maintained here, of course, provided one had a source of supply. A base here, incidentally, would have much the value of the Calm base on Luna. The Lotus did not find that base. It found no cities or signs of settlement. But it did find a bomb crater, miles across, and it seemed miles deep. There was an accumulation of reddish dust at its bottom, trapped from the thin winds that blew over this half-frozen world. The Lotus went on to Planet 5. The sun, so far out, was very small and its warmth was barely perceptible. But there was vegetation. The surface temperature was above freezing. The Loreac laws had predicted that the central metallic core would be small, and the greater part of its mass should be stony. The radioactives in Earth's thin rocky crust produce a constant flow of heat from the interior to the surface. It is considered that it is enough heat to melt a fraction of an inch of ice in a year. On this planet, with a crust many hundreds instead of mere scores of miles thickness, the internal heat was greater. The world was not frozen, and life existed here. It was a pallid, unnatural sort of life which had developed to live in starlight with a feeble assist from a very bright nearby star which happened to be its sun. There was a base here, too. Kelly located it when he found a resonant return of certain frequencies from the ground. It was not a reflection, but resonance. And so they found the base. It had been built by engineers the humans on the Lotus could only admire. There were gigantic doors which could admit the Lotus herself. They were rusted shut and had to be opened with explosives. There were galleries and tunnels and laboratories. There were missile launchers and missile storage chambers. There was a giant dome housing a telescope men had not even dreamed of equaling. It was not an optical telescope. Ultimately they found a mortuary, where the members of the garrison were placed when they died. The Lotus was not equipped for the archaeological and technological studies the base called for. Its function was to scout out things for especially qualified expeditions to study. And, of course, there was the political situation back on Earth. On the fourth day after landing, the skipper sent for Nolan. The skipper sweated a little. "Nolan," he said querulously, "we've found something." "A bug-eyed monster?" asked Nolan dourly. "No." The skipper mopped his forehead. "Back yonder, on 3, you took a few looks from 20 million miles and figured out what had happened there. We'd have worked it out eventually, but you saw it at once. You're lucky that way. Now we've found something. It's an instrument. We're short on time. Come with me and make some guesses." He led the way, explaining jerkily as he went. The thing was in a room by itself, with its own air system and apparently its own food store. It was inside 4 successive systems of locked doors, all of them inches thick stainless steel. It was intended that the last door could be opened from inside. It was evidently the very heart of the armed base on Planet 5. Anything sealed up like that would have to be either incredibly valuable or incredibly dangerous. Nolan followed through the shattered doors, and presently the skipper made a helpless gesture. There was the Discovery. It looked more like an old-fashioned telescope than anything else. It had a brass barrel, and it was very solidly mounted, and there were micro adjustments to point it with almost infinite exactitude. It had been sealed in a completely airtight environment, and what moisture was present had combined with other metals. It wasn't rusted. There was an eyepiece, placed in an improbable position, and there was a trigger. It wasn't like a gun trigger, but it couldn't have any other purpose. There was no porthole for it to fire through. The compartment in which it had been sealed was deep underground. Nolan said uneasily, "It's a weapon, of course." "Of course," said the skipper. He mopped his forehead. I think we should take it home. It might make a difference to WDA. But we don't know what it does. It could be a mistake." Nolan walked around it. He saw that it could be aimed in almost any direction. But not quite. There was a direction that stops prevented it from pointing to. Nolan said, "What's in that direction?" The skipper jumped. When Nolan asked the question, he began to suspect many answers. He said in a stricken voice, "That's where the missiles were launched and where the others are stored." Nolan stared at the thing. It looked hateful. It had the savage feel of a frozen snarl. "The power pile?" The skipper nodded. He mopped his face again. "Right alongside. We figured they wanted to shield the rest of the base from radioactives." Nolan said carefully, "It could be that they wanted to shield the radioactives from something in the base. Maybe something that would act on radioactives is involved." He said painfully, "Men can't change the rate of fission except by building up a critical mass. But maybe possibly bug-eyed monsters could." The skipper perspired. He'd have worked out the same thing in the long run, but Nolan saw it right away. He went away and got the ship's engineers. They brought an X-ray for finding flaws in metal. They took pictures of the inwards of the brass-barreled instrument in its place. They traced 2 separate, incomprehensible circuits. But they were separate. At long last the skipper nodded permission for Nolan to try the eyepiece, to see what it showed with heavy metal and much soil and vegetation atop it. They taped the trigger so it could not be moved. The controls affecting the eyepiece they left free. The skipper almost dripped sweat as Nolan turned on the eyepiece circuit, peering in. For a long time he saw nothing whatever. Then a tiny disc moved slowly into the eyepiece's field. It was barely larger than a point. Nolan moved one of the eyepiece controls. The disc enlarged. It enlarged again. A tiny red dot appeared in the center of the field of vision. As the disc enlarged, the red dot grew larger and became a tiny red circle. Nolan fumbled. He shifted the position of the instrument with a microcontrol. He moved the faintly glowing disc until it was enclosed in the red circle. He enlarged. Presently the disc was very large, and the red circle ceased to enlarge. It enclosed only a part of the disc. Nolan felt cold chills down his spine. He swallowed and asked for the angular relationship of planet 4 to 3. The skipper sent someone to find it out. But Nolan had found planet 4 before the answer came. The first disk was in some fashion a representation of planet 3, the Earth-like world which was dead. The second was a representation of 4. There was a bright spot near the equator of 4, the equator being located by the flattening of the poles. It would be just about where a gigantic atom bomb crater still existed. Nolan drew back and took a deep breath. Apparently, he said unsteadily, this eyepiece detects radioactives, converting something that I can't imagine into visible light after it's passed through a few feet of metal and a good many more of dirt. There's a red ring which makes me think of a gun sight. And there's a trigger. Skipper, would you send half an ounce or so of ship fuel out to space in a drone? I think we're going to have to pull this trigger. The skipper wrung his hands. He went away. And Nolan stood staring at nothing in particular, appalled and sickened by the thoughts that came to him. Presently the skipper came back and mumbled that a drone was on the way up. Nolan searched for it with the eyepiece. He found it. The sensitivity of the eyepiece was practically beyond belief. What it worked on, what it transmuted and amplified to light, was wholly beyond his imagination. The drone went 4,000 miles out. Nolan absently asked for somebody to be posted out of doors, watching the sky. He got the vivid spark that was the half-ounce of ship fuel in the center of the red luminous ring. He turned his eyes away and pulled the trigger. There was no sound. There was no vibration. There was no indication in the underground room that anything at all had happened. There was only a violent flare in the eyepiece, from which Nolan had just drawn back. Someone came shouting from out of doors that there had been an intolerable flash of brilliance in the sky. A few moments later the word came that the drone control board indicated that the drone had ceased to exist. The calm ambassador sighed a little when he saw the expression on the coordinator's face. Interviews with the titular head of the Alliance of all Western nations became increasingly a strain on his politeness. But the coordinator said grimly, I think I can guess what you're here to tell me. The calm ambassador said politely, it is painful to beat around the bush. May I speak plainly? Do, said the coordinator. Our base on the moon, said the ambassador with a fine air of frankness, some time ago reported military preparations on Earth, among the WDA nations. Those preparations could have no purpose other than an unwarned attack upon us. We felt it necessary, then, to take countermeasures of preparation only. We modified the plans for our moon base to have it contain not only the telescopes and such observational equipment, but to have an adequate armament of missiles. It is now so armed. The coordinator whitened a little, but he did not look surprised. Well? I have to inform you, said the calm ambassador, that any military action directed against any calm nation, or its troops, or the Union of Calm Republics, will be met by atomic bombardment from the moon as well as our standard military establishments. This, of course, does not mean war. To the contrary, we hope that it will end the possibility of war. We trust that all causes of tension between our nations will one by one be removed, and that an era of perpetual peace and prosperity will follow. The coordinator's lips twisted in an entirely mirthless smile. Military action against calm troops, he observed, means resistance to invasion or occupation, doesn't it? It would be wiser, said the ambassador carefully, to protest than to resist. At least, so it seems to me. The coordinator of the Western Defense Alliance said, tell me something confidentially, Mr. Ambassador. How long before you expect no? You wouldn't answer that. Ah. How long do you think it will be before I am shot? The calm ambassador said politely, I would hesitate to guess. The Lotus started back to Earth with the enigmatic weapon fastened firmly in its cargo hold. Great pains had been taken to keep it from being knocked or shocked or battered in its transfer to the ship. Firmly anchored, Nolan had insisted that the stops, which prevented it from being aimed below the horizon or toward the radioactives in the base, be adjusted so it could not be aimed at the Lotus's own engines or fuel stores. There were no missiles to worry about, of course. Even this precaution, however, roused doubt and uneasiness, especially among the scientific staff. It was highly probable that when the Lotus reported in from space, the comms would ask to examine such specimens as she brought back. The request would be expressed as scientific interest, but a refusal would be treated as a concealment of dire designs. There were those on the ship who felt that the weapon should be dismantled and made to seem meaningless, to avoid any chance of a humiliating squabble with the comms. The skipper roared at them. It was the only time on the voyage when he displayed anger. But he glared at those who proposed the act of discretion. He drove them out of the cabin in which the suggestion was made. He turned to Nolan, who definitely was not a party to it. His manner changed. He said querulously, "Nolan, why do you want that thing mounted so it could be used if necessary? That's the way it was mounted on Planet 5. To box it or case it might injure it. To take it apart might mean that it could never be got together in working order again." "Is that the real reason?" demanded the skipper. "It's a good reason, but is it the real one?" "No," admitted Nolan. "It isn't." The skipper fumed to himself. "We might get home," he said fretfully, "and find things just as we left them. Then there'd be no harm in the mounting. We'd at least try to diddle the comms and get it ashore without their knowing it was important. We might get home and find that war'd broken out and Earth was dead like the third planet back yonder, only not all yet turned to desert. Then the mounting wouldn't matter. Nothing would. Or we could find that the comms had smashed the West and were all cockahoop about what they'd managed to do in a sneak attack. So it had better stay mounted. I covered everything, didn't I?" Nolan wasn't feeling any better than anybody else on the Lotus. The jitters that affected everybody but conditioned comms had been bad when the Lotus went about its business. But when the ship headed for home, nerves got visibly worse. They didn't know what they'd find there. With the third planet of Phanuel Alpha in mind, it was all too easy to believe in disaster. "There's one thing," said Nolan painfully, "that bothers me. I've been trying to think like a calm top brass. The WDA is a well-meaning organization, and it's gained time, no doubt. But aside from the calm missiles, 95% of the atomic warheads on Earth are in the hands of just one WDA nation. It happens to be ours. It's been bearing most of the load of defense costs for the West. It's the richest country in the world. There's practically no poverty in it." "What has poverty to do with a possible war?" demanded the skipper. "Everything," Nolan said uncomfortably. "The comms take over a country. They march in. There are rich people and poor people. The comms start to humiliate and destroy the rich. The poor people hated them. So the comms are popular long enough to get things going right. But if they tried that in our country, it wouldn't work," said the skipper. "Not for a minute." "It wouldn't," agreed Nolan. "Most of our people think of themselves as well-to-do, and the rest can hope to become so. So the comms would have to try to govern 200 million indignant and subversive underground resistors. They couldn't hold down such a country. They wouldn't try." The skipper blinked. "If you mean they'd leave our country alone, I don't," said Nolan. "They'd destroy it. They'd have to. So they might as well destroy it out of hand and destroy most of the fighting potential and a lot of resolution in the West. A well-handled atomic missile bombardment and some luck, and they could take over the rest of the world without trouble. I think that's the practical thing for them to do. I think they'll do it if they can." The skipper grimaced. Then he said, almost ashamedly, "Maybe we're talking nonsense, Nolan. Maybe we've just got bad cases of nerves. Maybe things have gotten better since we left. We could arrive back home and find nobody even dreaming of war anymore. That," said Nolan, "would scare me to death. That would be the time to make a sneak attack." Which was pessimism. But nothing else seemed justified. It was not even easy to be hopeful about the value of the fifth planet weapon to the Western Defensive Alliance. The WDA couldn't use it in a preventive war. Their people wouldn't allow it. The initiative would always remain with the comms. The Lotus moved earthward. She carried a more deadly instrument for war than men had ever dreamed of. But the ship's company daily jittered a little more violently. The war might have been fought and be over by now. If it had, the comms would have won it. The coordinator for the WDA handed the comm ambassador his passport. "I'm sorry you've been recalled," he said heavily, "because I think I see the meaning of the move." "I am only called home for conference and instructions," said the ambassador politely. "I shall miss our friendly chats. We have had a very fine personal relationship, though we have disagreed so often." The coordinator absently shifted objects on his desk. He said suddenly, "Mr. Ambassador, have I ever lied to you?" The ambassador raised his eyebrows. Then he smiled. "Never," he said pleasantly. "I have marveled." The coordinator took a quick, sharp breath. "I shall not lie now," he said abruptly. "I hope you will believe me, Mr. Ambassador, when I tell you one of our best-kept military secrets." The ambassador blinked and then shrugged politely. "You always astonish me," he said mildly. "Your high command," said the coordinator grimly, "has decided not to try to take over the nation around us. It is considered impractical. So this nation is to be destroyed, to shatter the backbone of the WDA and make resistance anywhere else unthinkable." The ambassador said reproachfully, "Ah, but you begin to believe your own propaganda." "No," said the coordinator. "I have simply told you the facts you undoubtedly already know. Now I tell you our best-kept military secret. We know that we cannot deal with you. We know that you might be successful in an overwhelming, unwarned attack. We know that if you decide upon war, it will be directed primarily at this nation. So we have set up some very special atomic bombs where it is extremely unlikely that you will find them. They are dirty bombs. They are designed to make the maximum possible amount of radioactive dust of fallout. Timing mechanisms are set to detonate them. Every day a man goes and sets back the timing mechanism in each place where a bomb is established. On the day that a man fails to do so, the bombs will certainly explode." The coordinator said almost briskly, "We calculate that the bombs will make the atmosphere of the whole Earth lethally radioactive. They will raise the background count on Earth to the point where nothing can live, no plant, no animal, no fish in any sea. This will only happen if this nation is destroyed. It will fight if it is attacked, of course, but your chances of substantial success are good. But if you are successful, the Earth will die. I may add that the people of the comm nations will die also, to the last individual." The ambassador started to his feet. "But you could not do that," he protested white-lipped. "You cannot." The coordinator shrugged and shook his head. "I have not lied to you before, Mr. Ambassador. I do not lie to you now." Then he said formally, "I hope you have a pleasant journey home." Chapter 4. The Lotus came out of the usual sequence of arrival hops no more than 6 light seconds from Earth. 1,000,000 miles, more or less, perhaps 4 times the distance of the Moon. Nolan examined the planet's sunlit face and said steadily, "Nothing's happened yet." There was almost agonized relief. Only the skipper did not seem to relax. He went stolidly to the control room and got out the scrambler card that matched just one other scrambler card in the world. He put it in the communicator. To speak to Earth by scrambler would be an offense. It would be protested by the comms. They would insist that a survey ship should have nothing secret to report and that anything secret must be inimical to the Comm Association of Nations. The skipper formally reported in the clear, and then insisted on completing his report by scrambler. He did complete it, over the agitated protest of the ground. Then there was silence. He mopped his forehead. "Nolan, better get down to the eyepiece." The comms could send something up to blast us. I'll get the detectors out. You be ready. You're sure you can handle things? This is a little bit late to raise the question, said Nolan. I think I can do it, though. He went down into the hold. He turned on the eyepiece. He saw the distinct, luminous disk which was Earth in the not at all believable field of the impossible instrument. He saw points, not dots, of extremely vivid light. Obviously the size of a radioactive object did not determine the brightness of its report to the weapon from Planet 5 of Faneuil Alpha. Something else controlled the brilliance. He saw the groupings of many dimensionless points of light. There were the patterns which meant the silos holding the monster atomic missiles of the West. He could distinguish them from the much more concentrated firing points of the calm nations. The oceans had few or no bright points at all. There were only so many atomic-powered ocean-going vessels. Nolan could tell well enough which were the Western accumulations of radioactives for defense purposes, and which were the calm stores of warheads. His throat went dry as he realized the power in his hands. Neither he or anyone else could make one blade of grass grow, but he could turn the third planet of this sun into a desert in a dreariness like the third planet of another sun far, far away. The skipper came into the hold. He locked the entrance door behind him. I got to the coordinator, he said in a shaking voice. I started enough trouble by reporting by scrambler. He talked to me. I showed him pictures. He's telling the comms most of what I reported, saying that if they like they can try to blast us. If they try, and don't succeed, we can try to figure out what to do next. The comm premiership was in some ways the equivalent of the office of coordinator of the Western Defense Alliance. But the men who held the two posts were quite unlike, and the amount of authority they could exercise was vastly different. The comm premier read, again, the newly arrived message from the coordinator. The high officials he'd sent for came streaming into the room. Most of them had flimsies of the message in their hands. The premier beamed at them. You have the news, he said humorously. The WDA coordinator first threatened to make all Earth's air radioactive if we attacked the leading member of the WDA and destroyed it. He has evidently decided that this threat is not strong enough. So he assures us that a Western survey ship has come back from an exploring voyage with a cargo of artifacts from a non-human civilization. Among the artifacts there is what he says is the absolute weapon. He says that the skipper who has brought it back claims that it can end the tension between the WDA and us by ending us. The premier chuckled. He invites us to verify the skipper's claim by attempting to blast the survey ship, whose coordinates of position he gives us. I think he has made a rather substantial error of judgment. His eyes twinkled as he looked from one to another of the high officials he had summoned. We accepted the invitation, said the premier. Naturally. General? He looked at a tall general officer with twin silver rockets in his lapels. The general said proudly, Yes, Excellency. Our space radar located an object at the survey ship's stated position. We sent 6 rockets with atomic warheads at it. We used satellite placing rockets for maximum acceleration. They are well on their way now. Of course they can be disarmed or destroyed as well as maneuvered to intercept this survey ship if it attempts to flee. They will reach the target area in just under 3 hours. The premier nodded, very humorously. Since we accepted their invitation, naturally the Western staff concludes that we are disturbed. That we will wait to see what our rockets learn. It would be interesting, but our scientists tell me that the alleged weapon is impossible. Utterly impossible. So it is merely a trick. And we will not wait for our rockets to arrive. We might be late for our dinners, and we would not like that. The high officials made sounds of amusement. So we put our own ending to the comedy, said the premier blandly. The circuits are joined? He asked the question of a craggy-faced service of supply colonel. The colonel managed to nod, and was stricken numb by the importance of the gesture. Then, said the Premier humorously, we will destroy our enemy. He waddled across the room. He put a pudgy forefinger on a button. He pushed it. Even here, deep underground, there were roaring sounds as rockets took off for the west. All over the calm nations, carefully distributed rocket-firing sites received signals from the one push button. They sent bellowing monsters up into the sky. 3 calm rockets reached their targets, and Nolan never quite forgave himself for it. They were murderous. They wiped out cities. But that was all. The rest of the rockets went off prematurely. A spread of 100, crossing the North Pole, detonated just out of atmosphere. Others went off over the Atlantic. Not a few made temporary suns above the Pacific. Nolan brought moving specks within the thin red circle of his instrument, and pulled the trigger. The points flamed momentarily and left patches of luminosity behind them. And that was that. But they continued to rise. On Earth they made noises like dragons. There was panic from their starting points. Those first out had not reached their targets. So the calm launching sites flung more and more missiles skyward. One of them reached a city of the west. A second. A third. The only possible answer was to blast them as they rose. Then to blast them before they rose. Nolan's task became the terribly necessary one of preventing radioactives from moving away from calm territory and into WDA nations, specifically one WDA nation. He did not think of the consequences of his actions except in terms of preventing excessively bright mathematical points of light from getting to the areas where there were so many fewer points of similar light which did not move at all. He tried to stop only those that moved. But 3 got by him, and he could do nothing but detonate all the radioactives in calm territory. He had to. When that was done, there were 6 warheads coming up from Earth. He detonated them. There were massed warheads moving toward Earth from the Moon. It seemed that they practically tore space apart, that they went off together. Then the Moon base began to fire rockets, hysterically, at the Lotus. And it was necessary to detonate the radioactives in the Moon base. It had been estimated that an atomic war might be over in 3 hours. But prophecies are usually underestimates. Between the first and last explosions on Earth, in space, and on the Moon there was a truly gigantic crater where the calm base had been some 37 minutes elapsed. Then the war was over. There were some survivors in calm territory, of course. But they couldn't retaliate for the destruction of their nations. Their own bombs had done the destruction. They couldn't even gloat that the rest of Earth shared their catastrophe. It didn't. Most of the bombs exploded high, and over ocean. No less than 3/5 of all fallout landed in the sea and sank immediately. For the rest, the background count on Earth nowhere went above 4.9, and people could be protected against that. The survey ship Lotus came gingerly down to ground. There was no longer any reason for tension. Its crew reported in and scattered to the various places they called home. They were very glad to be back. In the course of time they were all suitably bemedaled and admired and told that their names would live forever. Of course, it was not true. Nolan didn't pay much attention to this. He left the survey. He went to live in a small town. He married a small-town girl. And he never took any one of the excursions so many WDA people took to see the result of atomic explosions in calm territory, when their attempt to murder one Western nation backfired. Nolan had caused that backfiring. He very passionately did not want to see its results. He'd seen all he wanted of that sort of thing on the 3rd planet of a Sol-type sun, some light centuries from Earth. End of 3rd planet. By Murray Leinster.